Good. Great story at the beginning of chapter 3 involving an encounter between philosophers, Wittgenstein and Popper, and a poker from a fireplace. And what was actually done with that poker, whether it was waved at somebody angrily or just waved merely as a way of making a point, or whether anything was said that brought it on, nobody really knows. But to the victor go the spoils in this story. Popper's the only one left around to tell anybody about it, and so he eventually constructed a narrative and believed it himself. Tom Wright says that he, in fact, had achieved some kind of triumph over Wittgenstein, which made him just stand up and leave. Now, whether that actually happened or not, we don't know. Wright tells that story to then get us into this conversation about eyewitnesses, that even when they disagree, and especially when they're all extremely, erudite and professionally concerned with knowledge and truth, they want what happened out there. You can't throw it out. And the Christian gospel affirms as the central fact without which there would be no gospel at all, that something happened perhaps 50 years before our most detailed records of it, about which those records don't exactly agree, and they don't. Some have said that this casts doubt on whether anything happened at all on the first Easter day. We have in the four Gospels, together with Acts and Paul, a first century equivalent of the varying accounts of Wittgenstein's poker, and Wright's question is now clear. What sort of an event was it? And just how empty was the tomb on Easter morning? Okay? All right. So without skipping a beat here, we go straight into the middle of one of the debates that has bothered the mainstream Western church for well over a century. William Temple, who later became Archbishop of Canterbury, did not get ordained until he had made up his mind that he really did believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Subsequent clergy, including many bishops, they haven't taken this same line. And David Jenkins famously whipped up a storm of controversy with his remarks about the empty tomb. Jesus' bones and conjuring tricks, though his words, like the exchange between Popper and Wittgenstein, have had an interesting subsequent career in oral and written tradition. So the question is, what should we believe about Jesus' resurrection and why? All right. So we're just kind of building the case here. All right. We're going to keep going. It's been muddled up too with several others related but distinct questions. And now it's often difficult to clear people's minds sufficiently to concentrate on the real issues. The issue is not whether the Bible is true or not. The issue is not whether miracles occur or not. The issue is not whether we believe in something called the supernatural or not. The issue is not whether Jesus is alive today and we can get to know him for ourselves. If we treat the question of Easter simply as a test case in any of those discussions, we're missing the point. Okay? Nor can we say, as many have tried to, that because we know the laws of nature. I mean, we're smarter than those folks back in the first century, Carol. I mean, they didn't know. We now know that Jesus can't have risen from the dead, as I have shown, as Tom Wright has shown in considerable detail elsewhere. The ancient world, with the interesting exception of the Jews, that were adamant that dead people did not rise again. I mean, y'all seen any? I mean, you may have, there's always one, there's always one. Yeah.
Matthew says dead people were walking around after Jesus rose.
We'll get to that. Yeah, that's going to be a good discussion about that. That's good. But resurrected people it just doesn't happen in the ancient Near East world. But the Jews, they had a different idea. Well, some of them did anyway. Or that anyone had done so, or that anyone would do so, all by themselves in advance of the general resurrection. That's what the Jews believed. But even when we've cleared away all of that, There's deep questions remaining. What precisely was it that the early Christians believed? There was a time when Christians had to formulate their beliefs and they didn't have a Bible. We got to go to that first.
Most of the Bible was taken from oral.
Uh-huh.
That was to say word of mouth,
Yeah,
wasn't
so-
it? Yeah.
Based on eyewitness testimony, of
50
course.
years later.
Yeah, 40 to 50
several
years
voices.
later. Toward the end of the first century. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the first 30, 40, 50 years of the church, they don't have, and now, get your copy of the Gospels out. No, there might have been somebody might have had a scroll of something they were working on. But yeah, so that's where we have to start first. What did they believe about it? And let's see, why did they use the language of resurrection to express that belief? And is it possible to mount a historical case for or against the empty tomb and the bodily resurrection, or will it always be a take it or leave it matter? Yes.
In the early church, they did have the Torah. And in the Torah, there was indication of what was going to happen with Jesus. So I would say that they were going back to the Torah and picking out parts to prove that Jesus was who he said he was.
Oh.
Jesus was the Christ.
Well, there wasn't anything about resurrection in the Torah. The first intimations of resurrection come to us from the prophet Daniel, long after that. But as far as the resurrection, not so much. And really not a lot about Messiah, if we want to get right down to it. That's going to develop. That's going to develop as Christianity begins, looking back into the Old Testament and going, hey, like Matthew, they're saying, hey, wait a minute, this fulfills. And most of the fulfillments are coming from the prophets and from the Psalms across the Gospels. Not a lot coming from the Torah. So, but they did, of course, yes, of course. They did have that.
That's the prophets and all were part of the Torah at Jesus' time. I know the Torah was made out of five books.
You're talking about the Hebrew Bible had not been put together as of yet. That actually doesn't take place until after the destruction of the temple. And then the Pharisees remain in power, and that's when they start to put together what we call the Hebrew Bible. It was actually at a council called Jamnia in 90 AD, which is also the same time when the New Testament documents are starting to be collected. That is when the Hebrew Bible took its first kind of official shape. Up to the destruction of Jerusalem, they were people of the temple. They were people of the sacrificial system. They did have synagogues that they worshiped in, of course, but the main heartbeat of their life was that temple in Jerusalem and the sacrificial system. But that all changed when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. And so, yeah, but that's very interesting. I mean, it really is. But resurrection, I mean, nobody else in the world believed it. And how far can history take us? What role does faith have? And how do they work together? The question is not simply, I like how he's such a historian, what we can know, but also how we can know. And at this point, all our knowing is called into question. Okay. So I wanted to get that particular part of this kind of out. And because that's going to guide the rest of the chapter here. I'm glad I went back to one chapter. I really am, because I was sitting there going, all right, Tom, tell me what you're saying. I read this a long time ago, so it's brand new to me again. All right. Now, anything else, Carol? You're back to highlighting. I like it.
Well, so far you've covered
Of
a
course I
lot
have.
of what I've highlighted.
Really a big letdown since November. I mean, it's just,
Oh, Look,
good gracious. I mean,
well,
Just highlighted the whole book.
there we go. Does that make you feel better?
it doesn't add anything to the discussion. Thank you, Carol.
No, it's just answering,
All
responding to your statement.
All right, cut, scene. All right, there you go. All right, sorry about that, folks. All right. So let's look at resurrection and life after death in ancient paganism and Judaism. Really, in ancient paganism, there wasn't any life after death. I mean, as he says, I love it at the bottom of 35. I am here summarizing the massive evidence I have set out elsewhere, and he has. And if you like to read, he'll tell you all about it. Bottom of that page there. Everybody knew there was, in fact, no answer to death. The ancient pagan world then divided broadly into those who, like Homer's shades, might have wanted. Everybody know what that's a reference to? Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. Have you seen Oppenheimer? Listen to that. What's the director's name? Nolan, Batman. There you go. Christopher Nolan's next movie is The Odyssey, one of Homer's works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like Homer's shades, Homer has these shades. All right, if you've seen Game of Thrones, the Night Walkers, the army of the night, they might have wanted a new body, but knew they couldn't have one. So the shades couldn't have one. Like Plato's philosophers also didn't want one because being a disembodied soul was far better. So again, it's in our hymnal. One of everybody's favorite old hymns because it's a toe tapper. I'll fly away. I'm telling you. I'm not about rapture or anything like that. It's just I'm going to get rid of this body and I'm going to be a disembodied soul. There's a little bit of that Plato in there for you. That's Plato, not Play-Doh. Okay? Now, within this world, the word resurrection in its Greek, Latin, or other equivalents was never used to mean life after death. Resurrection was used to denote new bodily life after whatever sort of life after death there might be. Okay? So when the ancients spoke of resurrection, whether to deny it, as all pagans did, or to affirm it, as some Jews did, they were referring to a two-step narrative in which resurrection, meaning new bodily life, would be preceded by an interim period of bodily death. Resurrection wasn't then a dramatic or vivid way of talking about the state people went into immediately after death. It denoted something that might happen, though almost everyone thought it wouldn't, sometime after that. This meaning is constant throughout the ancient world until the post-Christian coinages of 2nd century Gnosticism. Most of the ancients believed in life after death. Some of them developed complex and fascinating beliefs about it, which we have only just touched on. But outside of Judaism and Christianity, and Carol's favorite new word, she likes it so much she looked up what it means, Zoroastrianism. They're one of the earliest monotheistic religions, Persian in origin. Of course, they're a heresy, but they believed in one God, the Zoroastrians. Though the dating of that is controversial, right? They did not believe in resurrection. So resurrection refers specifically to something that happens to the body. Hence the later debates about how God would do this. Would he start with something new? Would he use existing bones, make new ones? All this stuff that Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 15. Those are the questions that the Corinthians are asking. Some of them are saying resurrection is not going to happen. He says, here's how it's going to happen. And he starts talking about putting something in the ground so that it comes up. What's planted is perishable. What's raised is imperishable. That all that stuff. But everybody knew about ghosts and spirits, visions, hallucinations, and so on. And most people believed in some such things. They were quite clear that that wasn't what they meant by resurrection. And then you remember the report of Herod. He thought that Jesus was John the Baptist, raised from the dead. He didn't think he was a ghost. He thought he was a resurrected John in a different body. Resurrection meant bodies. We cannot emphasize this too strongly, not least because much modern writing continues most misleadingly to use the word resurrection as a virtual synonym for life after death in the popular sense. Yeah. Okay. Anything? I'm not going to sit here and read. And then he picks on the Elvis cult again on page 37, and I don't blame him. Those people are nuts. They are. I mean, But anything, Carol, you got anything you want to add just to get some pressure off of you?
That first paragraph, when the early
Top
Christians.
37.
When the early Christians said that Jesus had risen from the dead, they knew they were saying that something had happened to him that had happened to nobody else and that nobody had expected to happen. They were not talking about Jesus' soul going into heavenly bliss, nor were they saying confusedly that Jesus had now become divine. This is simply not what the words meant. There was no implicit connection for either Jews or pagans between resurrection and divination.
Okay. Right. Ancient Romans declared the recently departed emperor had gone to heaven and become divine. Nobody dreamed of saying that he had been raised from the dead. It wasn't a category, right? The exception proves the rule. Those who believe that Nero had come back to life, a group we may suppose not unlike those who think Elvis has come back to life, despite his well-known and much visited grave, precisely did not think that he was now in heaven. Okay? So we just want to get that out of there. And then what about the Jewish world? This is really laid out well with the Lazarus story. And at the end of that paragraph there, Jesus says to Martha, your brother's going to rise again. And she says, I know he will. He's going to rise again in the resurrection at the last day. That is what resurrection meant to Jews. There's going to be a general resurrection at the end where everybody's going to. What's shocking is that Jesus came early, if you will. His happened here and now in the middle of history. They weren't expecting that. Nobody was. So anyway, Jesus' own teaching simply reinforces the Jewish picture. He redefines a lot of ideas that were current, especially about the kingdom of God, explaining in many coded parables and symbolic actions that God's sovereign saving rule was now breaking in, even though it didn't look like it. It didn't look like what they wanted. And you know that his followers, they didn't get it every time he brought it up. Wright uses the transfiguration story here. When Jesus says to them, don't tell anybody about this until after the Son of Man rises from the dead. And then the gospel writers say, and they questioned among themselves what this rising of the dead could mean, because they didn't know what he was talking about. They had no idea that, I'm going to die, on Friday, but don't you worry about it. Sunday. They had no idea, because that had never happened before, right? I mean, not yet.
Right.
All right. So let's see. We're looking here. The Sadducees, of course, bless their heart. They don't believe in the resurrection. I won't finish that, but the Pharisees do. And Jesus speaks of the resurrection where, as a complete event in the future, when all the righteous would be raised, and seems to have indicated that in this resurrection state, certain things would be different, so that there would be no problem about who had been married to whom in the present life. The point on which the Sadducees had tried to nail him down. Jesus wasn't worried about that. And then he says something about being like angels. He did not say that we would become angels. He said we would be, in certain respects, we would be like angels or equal to angels. Luke says equal, and Matthew and Mark say like. So there you go again. You got these different testimonies of people. Somebody heard him say like, and somebody, maybe another time he said equal. I mean, we don't know. But apart from this discussion, the only reference to the resurrection as a whole within the Gospels occurs in Matthew 13, verse 43, when Jesus declares that on the last day, the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Now, there's an echo here of Daniel 12, verse 3, that ensured that this would be taken as a reference to the resurrection. That's where it happens in the Old Testament. Okay? Now, Jesus speaks of the reward awaiting God's people. He can simply refer to the resurrection of the righteous in the normal Jewish way. In one place in the Gospel of John, he speaks of a coming resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So far, he's exactly on the map of first century Jewish belief. Unlike his redefining of kingdom and messiahship, when Jesus talks about the resurrection, he seems to have nothing new to say. I mean, he seems to be telling them what they should already know, except, of course, that he begins to tell them, well, it's going to be killed and raised again 3 days later. But we've got a fix for that, y'all. Many scholars have thought that these are what are called pseudo-prophecies, which is another fun word like Zoroastrianism. Pseudo-prophecies put in Jesus's mouth by the later church. Okay. Tom says, well, in short, no. That someone doing what Jesus was doing, thinking as he might have been thinking, was highly likely to foresee his own death, to speak of it in apocalyptic imagery and metaphor, and to invest it as the Maccabean martyrs were thought to have done with respect to their own deaths, with some kind of saving significance. In that world, someone thinking that sort of thing would be almost bound to say, in addition, and God will vindicate me after my death. And the kind of vindication they would have expected, as Second Maccabees again bears witness, would of course be resurrection. You need to read First and Second Maccabees. I promise you, it is a fascinating window. You'll read it and go, okay, some of this stuff I'm reading in the Gospels makes a little bit more sense here. The Maccabees were the first ones to kind of speak of being martyrs for the cause of God, and that God would raise us up. Be brave. Go to your death in the name of God, because God will vindicate you by raising you up. It's one of the first places that ever happens. And it's in between the testaments. That's what we call it, the intertestamental period, And it's there that kind of comes up for the first time in biblical literature. So, okay. But the disciples, wouldn't you know it, Sharon, they couldn't understand him. I mean, these were dark sayings. And we've got metaphor here going, apocalyptic metaphor about the Son of Man. He always spoke in third person, and the Son of Man. You will see the Son of Man. Cryptic, right? And they clearly thought they were meant to decode it, but they didn't know how. They really didn't. The last thing they imagined was that this kingdom bringer, this Jesus they were coming to believe might be God's Messiah, would actually die at the hands of pagan occupying forces. At no point do we even get a hint of anyone saying, oh, well, that's all right. He's got to go and die to save us, and then he'll rise again soon after. Yeah, so the one time that Jesus really does seem to have been trying to redefine the Jewish belief in resurrection by hinting that it was going to happen to him, they didn't have any idea. And that's where the transfiguration story comes in, where he tells them, don't say anything about this until the Son of Man rises from the dead. And they're looking at each other going, huh? What is he talking about? And it just seems so not the way it should go. Okay, so let's keep going. Everybody okay? It's hot in here. It was cold last night and hot today. And it shows, of course, that the crucifixion of Jesus was the end of all their hopes, right? All right, that was it. That was it. So I'm not going to read any more of that. This is, you get the idea. The Romans had the last word. We run this place. That's what crucifixion was. And the King of the Jews was a taunt. This is what happens to I think it was Fred Bigner who said, it literally said head Jew over Jesus's head, and said, this is what happens to the head Jew right here. And the Romans just letting everybody know, here's your king, right? So in other words, back off. Okay. So that's the world within which early Christianity burst upon the scene as a new thing, but it wasn't all new. What happens when we locate this sudden movement on the map of ancient Judaism within its wider pagan context. That's what we're going to do now. So here it comes. Because the church moves out from Israel, out into the Mediterranean, out into the Roman world, and to parts unknown at that time. I love what he says here, and there's a word of challenge here on page 41. The very beginning, I think it's worth reading, even though she didn't. Oh, did you just put a yellow line down the side of the page there, Kara?
Sometimes I do that.
To begin with, then, the early Christian future hope centered firmly on resurrection. The first Christians did not simply believe in life after death. They virtually never spoke simply of going to heaven when they died. As I have often said, alluding to the title of a good, popular book on this subject, heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world. And the footnote's worth seeking out on that. When they did speak of heaven as a post-mortem destination, they seemed to regard this heavenly life as a temporary stage on the way to the eventual resurrection of the body. When Jesus tells the brigand that he will join him in paradise that very day, you remember, it's one of our stations. Paradise clearly cannot be their ultimate destination, as Luke's next chapter makes clear. Paradise is, rather, the blissful garden where God's people rest prior to the resurrection. When Jesus declares that there are many dwelling places in his Father's house, the word for dwelling place is monē, which denotes a temporary lodging. In my Father's house are many rentals. This doesn't have the same effect, does it?
No, it doesn't.
But it is true. He's not making this stuff up. It means a temporary lodging. When Paul says that his desire is to depart and be with Christ, which is far better, he is indeed thinking of a blissful life with his Lord immediately after death, but this is only the prelude to the resurrection itself. So in terms of the discussion in the previous chapter, the early Christians hold firmly to a two-step belief about the future. First, death and whatever lies immediately beyond. Second, a new bodily existence in a newly remade world. All right. Now, his point is there's nothing like this in paganism. Nothing. All right. This belief is as Jewish as you can get, and it is testified in the rabbis. When we talk about people being when they die as being asleep, Paul uses that terminology. He says you're worried about those that have fallen asleep, and so it points to that reality. It doesn't discount being with the Lord right after we die. Of course not. It doesn't. But our final state is yet to be. Now, if we're looking at it from this side of things, and we're looking at what happened with Jesus, and some have called it life after death, I don't think you need to do that. I just think it comes in stages. We rest, but we're cognizant. We're aware. If you want to take something from that story we were looking at last night, the rich man was very much aware in his pre-resurrection state where he was, right? He was aware, and he was in torment, and he was away from Abraham's bosom. So that's a problem. But you can see that he was conscious of it. So that kind of thing. So I don't want to discount that, because I don't want people to think, you mean they're just laying in the dirt? No, that's not, for the ones that aren't, they might just want to be, in the dirt, but I don't, so I just want to make that clear. I really do.
Sounds good to me.
Hey, you and me both.
That's a good word.
You and me both. All right. Now, all right. So the pagans they didn't look at it like that. And we can go through Paul to John the Seer, Luke and Justin Martyr, Matthew and Irenaeus. These are all early Christians. This is highly significant because what people believe about life beyond death tends to be very conservative, and it does. Faced with bereavement, people lurch back to the safety of what they heard or learned before. But the early Christians all articulate a belief that is, in these 7 ways, quite new. And the historian has to ask why. And so now he goes through each of these, and I'm not gonna take a lot of time to go through these, but Any of these hit you? These, the 7, they're in order. He does a great job with them. The first is, within early Christianity, there is virtually no spectrum of belief about life beyond death. What people believe about life beyond death and the social and cultural ways in which these beliefs find expression is notoriously one of the most conservative features. There's just no spectrum. They just have a belief that, and it's very conservative, right? All right. Anything in that particular one? There's no trace of there being a Sadducean view, or that of Philo, who had different views. It's all, they believed in the resurrection. They believed in a period of rest and then resurrection, however long that period may be. All right. Anything in that one? So for 2 centuries, resurrection in the traditional sense holds not just center stage, but it's the whole stage, right? No problems. Nobody's questioning it. Well, but then there's a mutation. All right. In Second Temple Judaism, resurrection is important, but not that important. There are lots of lengthy works that never mention the question. It's still difficult. When you look at the writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's still difficult to see what they thought. You get highlights like 2 Maccabees chapter 7, but other than that, resurrection is a peripheral topic. But in early Christianity, resurrection moved from the circumference to the center. You can't read Paul without it, right? You shouldn't imagine John's thoughts without it. And then he gets to some names you might be as familiar with. It's also important in Clement, Ignatius, Justin, and Irenaeus. These are all part of the early church fathers who were writing some very important stuff. It's one of the key beliefs that infuriated the pagans in Lyon. I think, people say Lyons, but it's Lyon in AD 177, and drove them to butcher several Christians, including the bishop who preceded the great Irenaeus. Belief in bodily resurrection was one of the 2 central things that the pagan Dr. Galen noted about the Christians, the other being their remarkable sexual restraint. Take away the stories of Jesus' birth, and you lose only 2 chapters of Matthew and 2 of Luke. Take away the resurrection, you lose the entire New Testament and most of the 2nd century fathers as well. So that's huge. It's huge. You get it? Yeah. All right. The third one. In Judaism, it's almost always left quite vague as to what sort of body the resurrected will possess. Moving along. The big thing here is that it's going to be a transformed body. For me, that's why cremation is neither here nor there issue. But I understand why it is for some. I get that, and I respect that. It'll be a transformed body, a body whose material created from the old will have new properties. There has been a dramatic sharpening up of what resurrection itself actually entails, right? And so he goes on quite a bit in this one. I like what he calls it transphysicality. Bottom of 44. It doesn't involve being transformed into luminosity. Lights in the sky and all of that. We're just going to be incorporeal. No. Daniel 12, of course, speaks of the resurrected righteous shining like stars. That text is never quoted in the New Testament about the resurrection body except in the interpretation of one parable. That's in Matthew. When we do find it, it is used metaphorically of present Christian witness in the world. Yep. What we find then throughout early Christian resurrection belief is the view that the new body, when it is given, will possess a transformed physicality, but not transformed in the one way the central biblical text might have suggested. So Jesus' body, take for instance, dude could appear and disappear at will, locked doors, no problem. He could eat. I don't know what happened to it after he ate it, but we'll have to ask him. He could eat though. He says, you got a piece of broiled fish, you got some fish. He could eat. He could also disguise himself. He could not. He could make it to where you didn't know who he was. Now, that could just be something that is particular to Jesus himself, or it could be something fun for the rest of my existence. But you get what I'm saying. Transphysicality, it's going to be physical. All right. That's important. The fourth one, there's another mutation for you. Resurrection as an event has split into two. And now, and that, people have exceptions. There's always exceptions. What about Enoch? What about Elijah? They don't count, he says, because they were held not to have died. And so resurrection, new life after bodily death, would not be relevant. And B, they were in heaven, not in a new body on earth. Okay? Resurrection, we must never cease to remind ourselves, did not mean going to heaven or escaping death or having a glorious and noble post-mortem existence, but rather coming to bodily life again after bodily death. This is why, when after the transfiguration, Jesus tells the disciples not to mention the vision till the Son of Man has been raised from the dead, they are puzzled and wonder if it is to be an event that will leave them in a position to be telling people about details of Jesus' life rather than an event in which God's whole new world will be born. So they've got those competing. You've got to have the whole thing. You've got to wait and see what's actually going to happen. But it's different than what they think. All right? And then there's some other stuff here at the bottom. The bottom line here is, at the bottom of the page, 45, he says, we never find outside Christianity what becomes a central feature within it, the belief that the mode of this inauguration consisted in the resurrection itself happening to one person in the middle of history in advance of its great final occurrence, anticipating and guaranteeing the final resurrection of God's people at the end of history. Okay. Then he goes to Dominic Crowson here for the fifth one. Dom says, because the early Christians believed that resurrection had begun with Jesus, it would be completed in the great final resurrection on the last day. They believed that God had called them to work with him in the power of the Spirit to implement the achievement of Jesus and thereby to anticipate the final resurrection in personal and political life, in mission and holiness. It wasn't merely that God had inaugurated the end. If Jesus was the end in person, God's future arrived in the present, then those who belong to Jesus and followed him, they're charged with transforming the world. So that's kind of the both already and not yet part of the kingdom of God. Okay, the sixth mutation is the metaphorical use of resurrection. And some of these will be familiar, some of them not so much. Ezekiel 37, of course, pretty clear metaphor. By the time the rabbis come to the idea, and indeed already in 2nd Maccabees, 4th Ezra, and elsewhere, it is a metonymy. It's one part of the great eschatological picture standing for the whole. And when you read Ezekiel 37, what you're reading is one part of the whole of the resurrection at the end. But from the earliest days of Christianity, all the more remarkably when we consider how it began as a Jewish messianic movement, that meaning has disappeared when it comes to the restoration of Israel, making perhaps its only fleeting appearance in the disciples' puzzled question at the start of Acts, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? So we have it there, right? But we got a new metaphorical meaning of resurrection, which has already taken firm root by the time of Paul. And then that's resurrection as referring metaphorically to baptism, which we talk about as a dying and rising with Christ, and so forth, and so on. And those are the six. And then the final one was its association with messiahship. Nobody in Judaism had expected the Messiah to die. So, just logically, nobody had imagined the Messiah would be raised from the dead, right? I mean, it just wasn't going to happen. If he wasn't supposed to die, then yeah, I mean, it would be very tough. But I like what he says at the top of page 48 and the last sentence before the page break. From very early on, as witnessed by what may be pre-Pauline fragments of early creedal belief, the Christians affirmed that Jesus was indeed the Messiah precisely because of his resurrection. And he's referring to Philippians 2. The Christ hymn in Philippians 2, which may have been something that Paul quoted from. Got it out of the hymn book, I guess. Somebody had written that, if not himself, and he put it in there. It worked perfect for what he was trying to communicate there. All right, this is a lot of heady stuff, y'all. But he goes to great pains to basically, as the chapter closes out, he goes to great pains, to rule out the revisionism, to rule out, the ideas about the disciples being so overwhelmed with grief over what happened with Jesus that they kind of imagined that these things happened. And these are serious positions taken by serious scholars on a different side of this argument for not a literal resurrection, but a figurative spiritual resurrection. And they're serious and they're devoted. They're not trying to, destroy the Bible or anything like that. They've devoted their lives to it. They profess to be Christian, but I find it very hard to believe. That someone would go to the lengths that these first disciples and their followers and the ones that followed them and the ones that followed them and the ones that followed them would go to the lengths that they went to defend something that they all knew was a fabrication and wasn't true. And that if you went to the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, guess what you'd find? You'd find Jesus there, decaying, right? That baffles me. That it just I cannot understand why anybody would do that. But again, it goes back to the Potter. Listen to that, Potter. I don't forget what the guy's name is now, but the Wittgenstein. I don't forget his name, and Potter. We'll just call him Potter. He believed his own lie. He believed it so strongly that the story that he told, he believed it was the truth about what happened between him and Wittgenstein. Popper. Thank you. Well, I was close. There you go.
Karl Popper.
Yeah, Popper. That's good. Popper. But I just find that hard to believe. That you would convince generation after generation after generation all over the world to buy into that lie and to have it catch on that Jesus was not actually raised from the dead.
Especially since the disciples saw him and ended up dying a horrible death.
Yes.
You just wouldn't do that.
No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. And so what all of this does for us is moves us to, for next week, the very strange story of Easter. I fear our familiarity, helps us to forget how strange the story of Easter is and how very little we have. We really don't have a lot. We don't. I mean, I would have loved if Jesus had seen to it to have somebody in the 40 days that he was, the 50 days that he was back with the disciples, 40 days, that he was back with the disciples. I would have loved for him to have commissioned some writing on what he was teaching them after that.
Yes.
We may have some of that, maybe in those last chapters of John. Maybe he seems to be praying a prayer I'm not in the world anymore. He says, I'm not, that kind of thing. We might have a little bit, but it's so tantalizing. But we don't have anything from him except his last words to them. And he says, you don't worry about those things. You just go back into the city. I'm gonna what I told you I was gonna give you. I promise. Just go ahead and get on back. And then of course we know what happens after that. So, but we need to go back to the stories of Easter. And I think one of the wonderful things about Easter is the apostle to the apostles was a woman. The apostle to the apostles, Mary Magdalene. I have seen the Lord. She's the first one. Yeah, before Peter, before John, before Mary Magdalene. I have seen the Lord. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Go ahead, please.
In the middle of this,
Yeah,
next to the last,
go ahead.
a whole bunch of stuff I like.
Yeah.
Is the point of resurrection was that death has been defeated.
That's the last remaining enemy. That's right. So, yeah, even, and I think I've said this before, even, when you've been around the place as long as I have, I try to come up with original things. I really do. But even when death comes and it's an end to the suffering of somebody who's been suffering, and it's still an enemy, it's still a terror, it's still a rip, it's still not the way that God wanted things to be between us. And thanks be to God that, as you just read, it doesn't have the last word. The last word is resurrection. So that's good. Thank you for pointing that out. Appreciate that. All right. So chapter 4 next week. Now I'm going to go ahead and warn y'all, Holy Week. I don't know if you paid attention to the chalice, but I got y'all coming in here at 10 o'clock on Monday, Thursday, because we've got the communion service at 11. So if y'all think that's too early, Sharon, no, I mean, seriously, we can always just not have our meeting that week, but y'all can let me know. Okay. It's going to be a busy week, Holy Week. So, but chapter 4 for next week, we're going to hear about that and then going to get really rolling. So I think maybe I need to take this down to half a chapter a week. How about that? Even I admit to you, this is
It's a dead still.
it's that rope in the pool where it separates them, but don't walk. You can't walk down there. So this is down there under the diving board. It is. So, but let's just take it a chapter at a time, and we'll get it done.
I'm glad we're doing it though, because it's
it's good.
Mentioned
It's
things
good.
I just would not have. I didn't think
Like
about
Zoroastrianism. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
You're talking about how some of these scholars could get off on Jesus not actually being raised from the dead and stuff. And I believe this because it's true in my life.
Yeah.
That the closer you try to get to God, the harder the devil will work to put little things in your mind that get you off on a tangent.
No doubt, buddy.
And goes aside. One of the biggest problems I had are, and not some, well, I don't feel like I have it, but I did it one time. Was the closer I tried to get to God, the more I looked at, I thought I was here and everybody else was here.
Yeah.
And every question they had was because they wasn't as far along as I was.
Oh, yeah.
You sort of have a tendency to look down on people. And
that's fair.
I'm sorry it happened, but it hadn't happened since I've been here. But
I hear you and can affirm, and absolutely, it does, because he doesn't need to mess with the folks that aren't trying to grow closer to God. There's nothing to mess with. They're fine doing right just like they are, according to the adversary. But you start to dig, and you'll find some stuff in your way. You sure will. Sure will. All right. Hey, want to thank the ones of you who will be tuning into this. We appreciate you very much. And if you got any questions about any of this, please let me know. I'll try to answer them best I can. We look forward to being together again next week. And I hope you have a great weekend.